Everyone in Duluth told the old veteran never to leave for the desert, but he didn't listen. A lonely man wearing a red and black buffalo plaid jacket spent his last $700 on a rusted 1937 train car in Ely, Nevada, just trying to survive the winter. But his loyal German shepherd refused to sleep near the back wall. Night after night, the dog growled at the steel panels until one stormy evening the truth finally clicked open. Behind that rusted wall lay a secret that had been buried for 87 years. A secret powerful enough to clear a dead man's name and bring a dangerous family empire to its knees. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Winter smothered Duluth, Minnesota in a quiet, unforgiving cold, turning streets into pale rivers of ice beneath a sky the color of forgotten steel. Frank Miller worked alone in a beat-up garage beside an abandoned stretch of railroad where rusted tracks poked through the snow like bones. He was a man shaped by a long war and an even longer return home, 65 years old, lean and all angles, a face carved in hard lines, white stubble tracing his jaw like frost on granite. His salt and pepper hair stuck out beneath a wool cap, and over his broad shoulders hung his most loyal piece of clothing, a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket frayed at the cuffs, but still stubborn against the cold. His hands knotted with scars, burns, and old memories moved over a broken air compressor. Every movement was slow yet precise, like a soldier who once learned there was no room for mistakes. But tonight, his hands shook more than usual. The cold was getting into his bones, and so was the fear he tried not to name, aging alone. Behind him, in the dim light, Ranger, his German shepherd, lay curled on a threadbare blanket. The dog was 6 years old, a strong, muscular survivor with a silver-gray coat and a dark saddle of black fur, amber eyes, glowing with watchfulness and loyalty. Ranger had once pulled Frank out from a collapsed concrete wall during a desert conflict, saving him in ways doctors never could. Since then, their bond was something that didn't need words. The heater died first. Then the lights flickered. Then silence swallowed the room as the power was cut again. Frank exhaled, watching his breath float like smoke in the frigid air. A stack of unpaid utility bills loomed on the dusty workbench, electricity, rent, medical prescriptions that piled up faster than hope. The garage smelled of cold metal oil and the stale bitterness of instant coffee that never warmed him enough. He rubbed his stiff fingers together, trying to massage warmth into them, trying to massage life back into himself. Somewhere deep inside the ache of his chest, he missed purpose. He missed a reason to wake up. Ranger's ears twitched as Frank closed his toolbox and shuffled toward his battered laptop. The screen lit his weary features, blue light, making the age around his eyes even more visible. He typed slowly, searching half-heartedly for work, handyman, snow removal, scrap hauling. But every job listing felt like a reminder that no one really needed him anymore. He nearly shut the computer when a new post flashed on the feed. 1937, Union Pacific train car, $700. Must move before demolition. Located in Ely, Nevada. It came with a single grainy photograph, a lone train car standing upright in a field of dry grass, its rust glowing like old blood in the sun. Something about the stubbornness of that relic, the way it refused to collapse even after decades of being forgotten, reached into Frank like a mirror. He zoomed in, his eyes narrowing. Rust, bolts, steel plates, the faint outline of faded Union Pacific lettering. It was a part of history that had survived when nothing else did. Like him. Ranger patted over and rested his heavy head on Frank's knee. Those amber eyes said everything. Are we really thinking about this? Frank let a tired smile break across his chapped lips. We've lived through worse than a little rust, haven't we, buddy? The idea was reckless, borderline stupid. He barely had $700 left after rent. But sometimes a man needed to take a risk just to feel he was still alive. He clicked the phone number in the ad. A woman answered with a trembling but warm voice. Margaret Collins, 73 years old, widowed. She lived alone on the land with the train car. Her husband, Edward Collins, had been a railroad engineer gone missing during a storm in 1941 while working the Silver Line. They never found his body. It's just been sitting there, she said, trying so hard not to let grief shake her words. If someone like you wants to give it a home, I think he'd be happy. Frank swallowed hard at the longing in her voice. He knew what it was like to live with ghosts. I'll take it, he said quietly, surprising even himself. There was a long pause, then a soft breath of relief from the other end. Thank you, Margaret whispered, before they come to destroy everything he left behind. When the call ended, Frank sat motionless. Ranger nudged him gently, pushing his cold nose into Frank's palm. It was as if the dog believed in this mad choice more than Frank did. Morning came gray, bitter, and impatient. Frank packed with the rushing focus of a man who didn't want to give himself time to reconsider. A duffel bag of clothes, canned soup, a handful of blankets, his worn toolbox, a framed photograph of younger Frank in uniform ranger at his side. He slid behind the wheel of his dented pickup truck. The engine coughed like an old smoker before begrudgingly coming to life. Ranger jumped into the passenger seat and sat upright, ready as always to follow wherever Frank led. Frank looked around the garage one last time. The flickering bulb, the concrete floor stained by decades of labor, the silence that had grown too loud. This place had been shelter, punishment, and prison all at once. But now leaving felt like breathing again. Snowflakes spiraled across the windshield. Duluth faded behind them, just a white blur of frozen memories. Ahead stretched miles of highway disappearing into winter haze. Frank gripped the steering wheel, his gloves worn thin. There was uncertainty in his chest, but also a strange warmth blooming inside him, hope fragile as the winter sun. He rolled down the window slightly. Cold air stung his face, yet it felt cleansing, like pain that meant something was waking up. Just you and me again, partner, he murmured. Ranger thumped his tail once against the cracked leather seat. They drove south and west, chasing a rusted dream through shifting landscapes. Snow-buried forests gave way to long ribbons of highway, and mountains formed blue shadows in the distance. As daylight bled into copper and bruised purple, Frank whispered into the windshield, almost a prayer. Maybe this time the road will lead to somewhere worth staying. For the first time in a long while, Ranger closed his eyes, not to sleep, but content, trusting the man beside him. Frank reached down, resting a rough hand over the dog's head. He wasn't sure where this gamble would end, but he felt something he hadn't felt in years, movement inside his spirit, like a train starting up after years of stillness. The journey stretched onward, beneath a sky full of old stars. And somewhere far ahead, waiting beneath desert winds and rusted steel, an abandoned train car held a secret that would rewrite more than history. It would rewrite the life of the man driving toward it. The desert dusk fell thin and cold over Ely, Nevada, where winter winds scraped against steel and silence. Frank Miller's old pickup growled to a stop at the far edge of the small mining town, its engine rattling like a tired lung. Days of driving through snow-choked highways and silent plains had carved new shadows beneath his eyes. Yet as the sky dimmed into a rusty smear over the rugged Nevada hills, something in Frank's tired heart stirred a faint sense of arrival. His thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket caught the fading light, its familiar weight grounding him after too many miles spent chasing a purpose he wasn't sure existed anymore. Beside him, Ranger, the 6-year-old German shepherd, with a silver-gray coat and a proud dark saddle of black, stood alert in the passenger seat, tail still ears straight, pupils dialed into hyper-awareness. Ranger's gaze tracked the lone silhouette ahead, a 1937 Union Pacific train car, half consumed by time. Up close, the train car looked like a shipwreck marooned on land. Rust spread across its steel skin like old blood, and broken windows stared outward as hollow eyes. The earth around it was dry and cracked, but a thin crust of desert frost made everything shimmer in ghostly white. This was no home, yet it felt strangely like hope. A soft creak drew Frank's attention. On the porch of the weathered cabin nearby stood a thin woman wrapped in a brown wool cardigan. Margaret Collins, 73 years old, with silver-white hair pinned loosely behind her ears, carried the fragile dignity of someone who had grieved long and quietly. Her pale blue eyes, clouded a bit with age, still held a sharp glint of resilience. She walked with a slight stoop, knees stiff, but her hands, though bony, moved gently as she waved him forward. "You must be Mr. Miller," she said. Her voice was soft as a whisper, but carried the firmness of memories she refused to forget. Frank nodded and removed his hat. He wasn't used to meeting people's eyes anymore, but something about her sorrow pulled his gaze up. "Just Frank," he murmured. Margaret smiled faintly, but the sadness in her wrinkles deepened. "Edward, my husband. He used to call that train car his second home." She looked toward the battered structure, and her voice trembled ever so slightly with the weight of the past. "He was a railway engineer. Always said steel remembers what men forget." Frank listened closely, his heart stinging with recognition. War had taken pieces of him that steel would likely remember long after he was gone. She offered him the brass key warm from her palm. "You're welcome to stay here while you fix it up. Utilities are cheap enough. Besides..." She hesitated, then said quietly, "Someone should care for it before the county tears everything apart." Frank accepted the key with a quiet, grateful nod. Ranger pressed against his leg, sensing a change in atmosphere, new territory, new unknowns. The three approached the train car together, though Margaret lingered just outside the threshold, her fingers tightening around the doorframe. Inside, the stale air tasted of dust and metal and time. Ranger entered first, nose low to the floor, paws silent on the steel plates. Frank's boots clanked heavily behind him, and the sound echoed like footsteps in a tomb. The faint light filtering in through shattered panes painted long stripes across debris and rust. Ranger stopped abruptly, body stiffening. His amber eyes locked on a shadowed corner near the far end of the car. A low, rumbling growl vibrated in his chest. Frank followed his gaze. Just rust, he thought. But the dog's instincts rarely lied. "Easy boy," he whispered, though his own pulse quickened. His hand brushed along the cold metal wall, fingers grazing peeling paint and rough rivets, until they paused on a perfectly smooth circle, something hidden beneath decades of decay. A brass disc no larger than a coin. Frank pressed it. A crisp click cut through the silence, then a grinding metallic sigh. A section of the steel wall slid open, just enough to reveal a small secret compartment, a slice of history sealed away. Dust drifted out like a sigh from a forgotten throat. Frank reached into the darkness and lifted something that glinted beneath his flashlight beam, a silver pocket watch, its chain rusted but intact. He wiped at the tarnished back with his sleeve. Engraved initials shimmered faintly. E.C. Edward Collins. Ranger whined, nudging Frank's arm with anxious insistence, as if urging him to understand the importance of what he held. Inside the compartment, scratched into the metal with uneven and desperate strokes, were the words, "If you find this truth, still breathes here. E.C." Frank stared so long he forgot to breathe. His mind raced, truth, buried truth, waiting, truth asking to be released. He thought of the nights he woke in panic, drenched in memories that refused to stay silent. Maybe this was the same kind of truth war or railroad men always hid what scared them most. He carefully closed the panel, leaving the button exposed like a wound newly revealed. When he turned, Margaret was standing motionless by the doorway, one trembling hand pressed against her chest. "Is that—" Her voice cracked. Frank held the watch out to her gently. As her fingers wrapped around the silver object, tears slipped quietly from her eyes. "He never went anywhere without this," she whispered. Her shoulders shook, but she stood tall, refusing to collapse under the flood of emotion. They said the river washed away everything that night. But this— She looked up at Frank, hope and fear blending in her expression. "Do you think he left it for someone on purpose?" Frank didn't trust his voice. He simply nodded once. Margaret gathered herself enough to open the watch's clasp. Inside, alongside the initials, was another engraving, faint, almost erased by time, Bridge 7 under the iron triangle. A directive, a clue, a last message. Night fell fully, and the desert wind howled across the tracks like a train that no longer existed. Margaret returned to her cabin, the watch pressed to her heart. Frank sat on the metal floor, his back against cold steel Ranger, curled protectively at his feet. He stared at the dark wall where the secret had awakened thoughts spinning with a mixture of dread and purpose. He had come here running from his ghosts, unpaid bills, sleepless nights, a world that no longer needed him. But now this place, this relic, this truth needed him more than anything else in years. It felt like destiny, or maybe redemption disguised as rust. Ranger lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked toward the same hidden corner. Frank rested a hand on the dog's sturdy fur. "We're not alone in here, are we?" he murmured. Ranger's quiet huff was answer enough. The silver watch glistened in the moonlight, seeping through shattered windows, a tiny star of hope lodged in a dying world of steel. Frank closed his eyes, letting the bitter desert wind wash over him, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a man waiting for his life to end. He felt like a man on the brink of discovering why he was still alive. Night wrapped Ely, Nevada in a dark chill that scraped across corrugated steel and rattled loose nails like teeth chattering in a skull. The sky had turned the color of gunmetal, and a rare desert rain began to fall, thin needles of icy water, tapping against the rusted roof of the 1937 Union Pacific train car, where Frank Miller sat slumped beside the small cast-iron stove. His thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket rested against his shoulders like armor dulled by time, the familiar checkered pattern rising and falling with each slow breath he took. Ranger lay curled at the door, silver-gray fur rising in calm rhythm, for now amber eyes flickering like tiny lanterns as he listened to the outside world with a vigilance that only a battlefield could create. Frank's fingers traced the engraved letters on the silver pocket watch, EC. And though he tried to maintain the hardened resolve that had once kept him alive overseas, his mind churned like the storm outside. He had come to Ely to escape the noise of his past, not to awaken someone else's. Yet fate had a cruel talent for dragging old soldiers back into fights they never asked for. Unable to quiet the questions gnawing beneath his ribs, Frank reached for his old phone screen, cracked signal weak, and scrolled through a list of contacts he hadn't touched in years. He stopped at one name: Olivia Carter. She had been the only person who could read him during deployments, the friend who always understood his silence. Olivia was now a Nevada state investigator, still living by the same code of justice that had shaped her into one of the most respected figures in the precinct. Frank tapped the call. The line rang twice. Miller. A low, firm voice answered, edged with surprise and familiarity. Frank exhaled, tension melting just enough to speak. He explained the pocket watch, the hidden compartment, the engraved message about Bridge 7 and the Iron Triangle, and how the widow Margaret had nearly fallen apart at the sight of it. Olivia listened quietly, the way she always had, never interrupting, never doubting. Frank could picture her clearly tall, lean, about 40, hair cut short, just below the ears, and dyed a muted ash brown streaked with desert sun. Eyes a steely gray-green with a habit of narrowing whenever she scented a lie. A faint scar cutting across her right brow, earned from an investigation gone wrong. In her early days, a reminder that truth never arrived without a fight. Olivia carried a fierce loyalty under her crisp and composed exterior. She worked long hours, ate cold dinners, and trusted almost no one except Frank. Edward Collins, she murmured through the line. I've seen that name buried in century-old complaints about missing gold shipments. Rail records from 1937. Something big disappeared. Papers shuffled on her end. Keys clacked. Give me a few hours. And Frank. Her voice softened human warmth, threading through steel. Be careful. You're stepping into a story someone already risked their life to keep hidden. 2 hours later, while the rain deepened into a restless drumming, Frank's phone buzzed again. Olivia's tone had changed, sharper, colder. I found the connection. The gold wasn't just lost, it was stolen. The Oversight Office filed a claim of internal theft. The whistleblower was Edward Collins, Margaret's husband. Before he could testify, they accused him of espionage, fabricated charges, sealed the evidence, and he vanished. Frank's stomach dropped, anger flickering like embers in his chest. He glanced at Ranger, who watched him with alert eyes that seemed to say, "We've seen this pattern before." Olivia continued. The company he accused. It became part of a private mining empire decades later, Pierce Mining. And its current CEO's family is the same line that benefited from the stolen gold. Frank stared at the pocket watch like it had grown heavier in his palm. Almost as if summoned by the conversation, headlights cut through the rain-drenched field outside. A sleek black SUV rolled to a stop in front of Margaret's cabin. Frank stood, automatically, war instincts tightening his posture, as Ranger growled low. A tall man stepped out, the kind whose confidence was born from expensive lawyers and inherited power. Eric Pierce, roughly 35, clean-cut, blonde hair, slicked back jaw sharp enough to slice marble, and ocean blue eyes devoid of warmth. His suit was finely tailored charcoal gray, and his shoes glistened even in the mud, too polished for a place like Ely, too polished for truth. With a diplomatic smile glued to his lips, he approached the train car door. Mr. Miller, he greeted with empty politeness. Frank kept the door half closed, Ranger's snout visible through the gap, teeth bared. Eric continued, tone smooth as oil, I represent the Pierce family. My grandfather worked with Mr. Collins, and it appears you've found something of company interest. His gaze dropped to Frank's jacket, spotting the bulge where the pocket watch was concealed. We'd like to recover it, and we're willing to offer you $100,000 in cash, no questions asked. Frank's heart thudded. That amount could fix everything: medical bills, a real home, food that didn't come from a can. But a lifetime of seeing men buy silence had taught him one truth: the moment money enters honesty's door, dignity leaves through the window. Frank straightened his shoulders, eyes steady. Funny, he said, voice rough like gravel, your family name isn't on it. Eric's smile froze. The polite mask cracked just enough to show the cold underneath. Be careful, Mr. Miller. Some debts buried in the dirt have very long hands. Then he turned, entered the SUV, and was gone, leaving a swirl of dust and threat in his wake. Rain thickened into sheets that slapped against steel and soil alike. Frank locked the train car door and sat beside the stove, but calm refused to settle. Ranger paced, hackles, lifted nose twitching with uneasy intuition. When the first crunch of footsteps hit the gravel, Frank's breath caught. Ranger erupted into a vicious bark, hurling his body at the door just as it burst open, wrenched wide by a crowbar. Two masked intruders lunged in silhouettes ripped from the flashing stormlight outside. One swung a metal pipe whistling past Frank's ribs, while the other reached for the watch in Frank's pocket. Instinct roared awake inside him. Ranger launched like a missile, slamming one attacker to the ground with jaws snapping at the man's arm. Frank grabbed the nearest tool, a wrench, from his work belt and swung with the clarity of survival. Bone cracked under steel. A shout cut through the rain. The second intruder scrambled, slipping in mud, before fleeing into the dark. Frank stood panting, blood his and someone else's running hot beneath the cold storm, Ranger whimpering as a red streak spread across his flank. Frank dropped to his knees, hands trembling as he pressed the dog close, whispering through clenched teeth, "You're okay. You're okay." But fear gnawed at his voice, fear of losing the only soul he couldn't afford to bury. Red-blue lights shattered the darkness. Police SUVs rolled up the slope, kicking mud as officers fanned out, weapons drawn. Olivia was the first out of the lead vehicle, wearing a tactical dark jacket and jeans tucked into mud-stained boots. Her hair was damp from the rain sticking to her forehead, around that scar across her brow. Her gray-green eyes took in the scene in seconds, the broken door, the unconscious assailant groaning in the dirt, blood on Frank's plaid jacket and Ranger's wound. Concern flared in her expression, quick but real, before she masked it with professional steel. "Secure the area," she barked at the officers, her voice sharp enough to cut through storm wind. Frank pushed himself upright, stubborn dignity anchoring him, even while pain hammered beneath his ribs. "They came for the watch," he said. Olivia crouched beside Ranger, checking the wound carefully with practiced hands. "They weren't amateurs," Frank added. "One had a silenced weapon. They knew exactly where to strike." Olivia nodded, mouth tightening. "Pierce Mining doesn't send beggars to collect their secrets," she murmured. Then she looked up, and for the first time Frank saw something like fear flicker across her features, not for herself, but for what this meant. For how deep the corruption went. For the enemies now staring back at them from the shadows of history. As officers taped off the perimeter and sirens faded beneath storm wind. Frank stood in the doorway of the old train car, shoulders squared against the night. He glanced at the pocket watch, still safe in his jacket. Still ticking no. Still stopped at the precise moment truth had been buried. Ranger leaned against his leg despite the sting of his injury. Olivia joined him at his side, rain sliding down her jawline like tears she refused to shed. The three remained in that threshold between the past and whatever battle waited next, while lightning flashed over the desert rails that had not carried justice in 87 years. And Frank knew with a sinking certainty this was no longer about survival. This was a mission, one last mission, that demanded everything he had left to give. The sun bled copper across the Nevada horizon, as a convoy of vehicles carved a slow path through dry earth and wind-carved stone heading toward a place where truth had once been buried alive. Frank Miller sat in the front passenger seat of Olivia Carter's SUV, his hands resting over his thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, as if it were the final shield between him and the world. His breathing remained steady, but his eyes gray, weathered, and edged with the sharp awareness of a soldier never stopped scanning the terrain ahead. Ranger, his 7-year-old German shepherd with silver-gray fur and a bold black saddle along his back, stood braced in the bed of Frank's old pickup, following behind them, paw's firm tail low, but unwavering. His amber eyes fixed on the distant steel silhouette of Bridge 7. The wound on his flank had begun to heal, but like Frank, he was a creature who knew danger didn't end just because daylight arrived. Bridge 7 rose from the valley floor, like the skeleton of something ancient and loyal. Iron beams, rust-scarred bolts, corroded rail ties long since torn away. The land beneath it was fenced and stamped with Pierce mining. No trespassing signs, each one glaring like a warning that the past should stay silent. But they were not here to obey silence. Truth stirred beneath their feet. As they parked, Lieutenant David Reyes stepped forward, a broad-shouldered officer in his late 30s with thick black eyebrows, a jaw like carved granite, and a trimmed beard peppered with desert dust. His uniform hugged a frame that spoke of former high school football glory, but his movements were measured and calm. Reyes had built a reputation on fairness. He treated even criminals like human beings until they proved him wrong, and he hated corruption like poison. His brown eyes flicked toward Frank and softened slightly when he noticed Ranger leaping from the truck, sturdy but careful with his injury. "Brave dog," Reyes said. Frank nodded once, grateful for the respect shown to his partner. Nearby, a woman from the Nevada Historical Conservation Bureau arrived. Her long gray braids swung as she adjusted glasses on her slender nose. Her name was Dr. Helen Grant, a historian in her early 60s with a voice full of books and buried stories. Her life had been spent cataloging artifacts of men who dreamed too big or fell too fast, but she'd never seen a mystery like this, gold missing for 87 years, hidden by a man erased from his own history. Frank caught her staring at Bridge 7 as if it were a creature finally willing to speak. Olivia Carter commanded the scene like a general preparing for a quiet war. Her tall, athletic posture and short ash-brown hair lent a fierce authority to every step she took. Her gray-green eyes, sharp enough to slice through lies, studied the coordinates engraved inside the pocket watch and matched them to the earth. She knelt near 3 massive boulders positioned in a near-perfect triangle beneath the bridge. Wind licked at her tactical jacket, pushing strands of hair across the scar above her right brow. "Right here," she said, tapping the center point of the rock formation with her boot. Frank crouched beside her, his knees crackling with old pain. "Edward must have known they'd come for him," he muttered. He hid proof where greed wouldn't think to look. His fingers brushed dusty soil, and chills climbed his spine. Buried secrets always carried ghosts. Reyes whistled his team closer. Shovels struck ground with metallic clinks. Dirt flew. Dust rose. Ranger circled, sniffing every shift in scent, his muscles tense beneath scarred fur. Minutes became an hour as the hole deepened, revealing first rust flakes, then the curve of something artificial. A hollow thunk echoed beneath a final shovel strike. Everyone froze. The dirt was brushed away carefully until the top of a large iron strongbox emerged, its metal pitted with corrosion, yet unbowed by time. On its lid, branded into the steel and almost erased by rust, were the faint words, "Union Pacific Freight, 1937. Frank's heart hammered. His breath grew short. Olivia's eyes held both triumph and dread. Reyes radioed in the discovery, while Frank's hands worked the old locking mechanism. They rattled from cold and from the weight of history pressing down on him. It took nearly an hour of tools, sweat, and whispered curses before the lock finally surrendered with a screech like a dying whistle. When the lid swung open, gold illuminated the gathering dusk. 31 bars each, stamped with serial numbers long thought lost, stacked neatly like soldiers waiting to be called upon again. But they were not alone. Bundles of documents sat carefully wrapped in oiled cloth ledgers, reports, letters bearing Edward Collins's signature, proof that he had attempted to expose fraud so monumental it could ruin empires. And pinned inside the lid, protected by thin tin, lay Edward's final declaration: "I did not steal this. I saved it from thieves. The truth must breathe." Dr. Grant covered her mouth, tears trembling at the corners of her eyes. History was not supposed to weep. Reyes nodded once, jaw tight. Justice had finally found a crack it could fight through. Frank stared at the gold, but it wasn't the money that made his throat tighten. It was the courage in the ink of Edward's handwriting. The sacrifice, the loneliness, the quiet death of a man who had done right and paid for it with everything. Frank felt his chest clench. He whispered under his breath as if Edward might hear across time, "We found it. You're not forgotten anymore." Media vans arrived before sunset faded. Reporters swarmed like locusts with microphones instead of wings. Photographers flashed lights like lightning against the iron beams of Bridge 7. Olivia stood before them all, shoulders straight, voice unwavering as she spoke the words that would dismantle decades of silence. Edward Collins is cleared of all charges. His bravery reveals a historical theft that affected generations. He died a hero. Margaret Collins arrived in the middle of the chaos, escorted by a young officer. Her small frame in a brown cardigan looked breakable amid uniforms and cameras. When she saw the strongbox, her breath broke. Rangers trotted to her, resting his head gently against her thigh, offering comfort the way only a loyal creature could. She stroked his fur with trembling fingers, whispering near silent thanks. Olivia placed the pocket watch into Margaret's hands. The widow closed her eyes and pressed it to her heart. "He tried to tell the truth," she whispered, "and now the world finally listens." Her voice both victory and grief. Frank, meanwhile, stood on the outskirts, never comfortable under spotlights. His plaid jacket was an odd splash of rugged red among the polished uniforms and business suits. He wasn't a senator or prosecutor. He didn't wear medals anymore. He wasn't there for applause. He was just a soldier fulfilling another soldier's unfinished duty. Ranger sat beside him, posture relaxed, but alert, as if guarding his human against praise he didn't want. Camera crews turned toward Frank eventually, but he stepped back, letting the narrative belong to the man who had earned it with his life. Under the glow of camera lights, his eyes drifted to Ranger, who looked up with a slow wag of his tail, as if saying they had done what they came to do. But as the final photos were taken, and officials began transporting the gold and documents, Olivia approached Frank quietly. Her voice carried a warning. "The Pierces won't let this go. They're watching. This isn't over." Frank looked up at Bridge 7, rust, decay, and truth all refusing to fall, and nodded. He knew corruption didn't crumble just because the world caught a glimpse of it. There would be retaliation. There always was. Yet he placed a steady hand on Ranger's back and squared his shoulders against the cooling night. Whatever battle came next, he and the loyal dog at his side were no strangers to war. Winter crept into Ely, Nevada again, but this year, its chill came without the bite of abandonment. The air still smelled of dry sagebrush, and the nights still carried the same sharp wind that whispered across desert stone. Yet something essential in the town had changed. Hope had taken root, where silence used to reign. Frank Miller walked the length of the restored 1937 Union Pacific train car, his heavy boots crunching over gravel dusted with the first thin veil of snow. The once rusted relic, which had stood forgotten at the edge of the world, now gleamed with deep navy blue paint and polished brass trim that caught every glint of winter sunlight. What had been a tomb of truth was now a monument to it. Frank paused to rest for a moment, leaning one calloused hand against the cool metal of the car. His red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket clung to him like a second skin, worn tough, softened only by time, much like the man himself. His face bore the creases of decades survived rather than lived, stories etched into the corners of his eyes, scars left by battles, both the kind fought with rifles and the kind fought alone in dark rooms. but the haunted look that once flickered behind his eyes had lost much of its grip. Something steadier lived there now, belonging. Ranger padded toward him, tail sweeping once across the ground. The German shepherd's silver-gray fur shimmered as if brushed by moonlight, even under the sun, and the black saddle on his back contrasted sharply like a warrior's cloak. His ears flicked to every sound: footsteps, laughter, the rattle of souvenirs in visitors' hands. And though he limped just slightly from his healed wound, his spirit had never stood taller. Children visiting the historic site always stopped to pet him, calling him the guardian of the rails, and Ranger in turn guarded the heart of this new world. A group of visitors passed by, guided by Evan Brooks, a young volunteer with wide shoulders and a friendly smile that still looked surprised to be working anywhere meaningful. Evan was only in his early 20s with sandy hair that refused to stay flat, and a voice that cracked slightly when nervous. He had recently left the Marines, shaken from the kind of war that took more than it gave. Frank saw much of his younger self in the uncertain way Evan carried hope, like a fragile thing that might break if someone stared too hard. Near the small wooden cabin adjacent to the tracks, Margaret Collins sat swaddled in a caramel-colored shawl, hands folded in her lap. Her hair had turned fully white, soft as winter frost, and her steps had slowed over the year, but her spirit remained alight. She watched visitors examine displays that told the truth her husband died protecting. Every now and then she pressed a tissue to her eyes, but these tears were different. They were the kind that watered the roots of stories finally allowed to grow. Inside the train car, the air smelled faintly of polished oak and possibility. Warm amber lights lined the ceiling, reflecting off framed black and white photos of Edward Collins and the original Silver Line crew. Behind protective glass near the restored conductor's seat, the silver pocket watch hung suspended by its rusted chain. The hands frozen at 2:17 pointed forever, at the moment the truth was locked away. Olivia once asked Frank why he didn't have the clockmaker restart its ticking. Frank had stared at the tiny crack running through the glass and said simply, "Some moments deserve to stand still." And that was how the Collins-Miller Foundation was born, from pauses in time that demanded breath again. Frank walked outside, Ranger trotting beside him. Along the fence, a new sign burned gold in the sunlight. "Callaway Memorial Truth still breathes here." It was the historian Dr. Helen Grant who insisted on that inscription, a short woman with large glasses and stubborn optimism. She had spent months coordinating with state officials to make the site both museum and sanctuary, often falling asleep at her desk, surrounded by handwritten notes and donated memorabilia. Up the path, Olivia Carter approached, with long strides, the crisp winter wind, teasing strands of ash-brown hair, loose from behind her ears. In her off-duty clothes, dark jeans, a fitted jacket, boots dusty from volunteer work, she looked less like the hardened investigator Frank had met, and more like someone rediscovering her humanity. Her gray-green eyes had softened over months of community rebuilding, and she wore a faint smile now, the kind that slipped out when she wasn't guarding it. "Busy day today," she said, stopping beside Frank. She crossed her arms, glancing toward Evan, guiding another pair of visitors. "Truth has a way of drawing a crowd," Frank replied, voice low but warmer than it used to be. He scratched behind Ranger's ears, and the dog leaned into him with a soft grunt. Olivia studied Frank for a moment. "How are the nightmares?" she asked gently, but without pity. "They're quieter," Frank said. "Ranger still wakes me before they get loud." He looked down at his dog, gratitude tightening his throat. "We keep watch for each other." "That's what families do," Olivia murmured. Frank chuckled softly. "Family, huh? Never thought I'd find one in an abandoned train car." He paused, eyes drifting toward the horizon. "Or that the past could give me a future." A little girl approached, clutching a plush German shepherd toy nearly the size of her torso. Her mother trailed behind, with a mixture of embarrassment and adoration. The girl stopped right in front of Frank, eyes huge. "Are you the hero?" she asked. Frank blinked, startled. Ranger barked once, as if amused. "No, sweetheart," he said, kneeling, his knees cracking loudly. "The hero's up there." He pointed to the watch inside the train car. "He's the one who kept the truth alive. I just dug it up." Still, the girl wrapped her tiny arms around Frank's neck, and he froze, unsure what to do with tenderness that came without asking. Ranger pressed beside them protectively, and the little girl giggled, burying her fingers in his thick fur. Her mother mouthed thank you before guiding her away. Frank stood slowly watching them disappear into the museum space, and Olivia nudged his arm. "Like I said," she whispered, "family." Later that evening, Frank sat on the restored wooden steps of the train car, Ranger at his feet. The desert sky darkened into an ocean of stars, and the faint scent of coffee drifted from the cabin porch, where Margaret and Dr. Grant sipped from matching mugs. Visitors drifted off, one by one, until only the foundation team remained. Snowflakes, rare and delicate in the Nevada desert, began to float lazily downward, like wandering feathers lost from a cloud. Olivia came outside and stood beside Frank. Silence settled, not empty, not heavy, but full of breath and light. Frank rested a hand on Ranger's back, feeling life thrum steady beneath his palm. "We finally found our home, huh?" Buddy Ranger lifted his head, ears perked, and barked once softly. A small sound, but it echoed up the steel beams and across the open land, as though acknowledging every ghost who once felt forgotten. The 1937 train car glowed in the starlight, a vessel that no longer traveled rails, yet carried countless hearts forward. Winter remained sharp, but the cold no longer pierced. The truth had been unearthed from rust and shadow, and in doing so it thawed the frost from souls who needed more than survival. They needed meaning. Frank looked up at the stars, and for the first time in a very long while, they didn't feel far away. In the end, this story reminds us of something deeper than old rails, forgotten gold, or a train car reborn under the desert sky. It reminds us that truth is never truly buried, not when God is still at work in the quiet corners of our lives. Miracles don't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come in the form of a loyal dog, a stranger who chooses kindness, or a door that finally opens after years of silence. Just like Frank and Ranger, each of us walks through seasons where hope feels thin and winter feels long. But God has a way of guiding our steps even when we don't understand the path. Even when the world tells us we're too late, too tired, or too broken. If you are facing your own battles, hold on. The same God who watches over forgotten men in forgotten places is watching over you too. And He still brings truth to light. In His time, not ours. Before you leave, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Share your city, your state, or your country in the comments. Your stories and your presence here mean more than you know. If this journey touched your heart, please share it so it may inspire someone who needs strength tonight. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe for more stories of hope, redemption, and the quiet miracles woven through ordinary lives. May God bless you, protect your home, guide your steps, and shine His grace over every person watching this. And may you always find light, no matter how long the winter.